Hello and welcome back to the Envirotech Online podcast, your regular update on everything that's going on in the rapidly changing world of environmental monitoring. As usual, I'm Jed Thomas, content editor here, but for the first time, I'm without Alan Booth, my trusty co-host, so it feels like I'm missing a limb or something. But luckily, I'm not entirely alone because I'm joined by Stephanie Metzger, policy advisor at the Royal Society of Chemistry, who recently featured on Panorama's episode on PFAS, or forever chemicals as they called them. We're going to talk about everything PFAS, including some of the new developments in government policy that have happened this week. So thank you for joining me, Stephanie. Firstly, can you tell us about what you know of the EIP 2025 and what you think the UK government's PFAS plan ought to look like? In particular, what role will monitoring play in that plan?
Well, thanks so much for having me today. Yeah, this is a really great announcement that the new Environmental Improvement Plan was finally released. And as you say, they had a whole section on PFAS, which included the creation of an action plan, as well as some actions for the Environment Agency and for DEFRA, the Environment Agency, and HSE on chemicals regulation law. But the action plan is expected next year, and we're hoping that it covers a broad range of areas because PFAS is so prevalent in supply chains from upstream to downstream to the environment and to products that we use in our lives. And so it sort of needs to be quite comprehensive. So there's a few things. We hope that, first of all, it takes a cross-governmental approach to addressing PFAS, because there are areas that touch on many different government departments. So, for example, consumer products are managed by the Office of Product Safety and Standards, which is in the Department of Business and Trade. We have DEFRA that does environmental work, chemicals regulation, farming. The Environment Agency obviously helping them to implement that, and Health and Safety Executive. There's also the Food Standards Agency, which is another body that deals with, as it says, things in food. And then the Drinking Water Inspectorate and Ofwat, which deal with water companies. Now that body might change soon due to the government reorganizing that sector as well, but whatever regulator ends up, they're going to be involved too. So we think that this plan definitely should be taking a cross-governmental approach that understands the whole life cycle of PFAS. It definitely needs to include actions upstream, so that would deal with the manufacture of PFAS and the use in manufacturing processes. So this would include things like environmental permitting to make sure that we're stopping pollution at the source. It needs to include a better understanding of how PFAS moves through supply chains, as well as, again, where it ends up, to make sure that we're using it in appropriate ways and not allowing exposure to happen to the environment or to us. And then also downstream at the other end, and the waste end of the cycle, where how is PFAS managed at the end of its life? How does it affect things like our goal to move to the circular economy? So there's, a lot of different areas we could talk about. One thing about this topic is it's obviously so broad, and, well, not obviously necessarily, but we've learned that it's so broad, and it's really, I think, a good example of how some of these issues about chemicals, the management of chemicals or the management of materials, seem perhaps like narrow issues, but actually they often are bigger than we think. And then you asked about monitoring, and that's certainly a big part of this. First of all, we need to know where pollution is entering the environment. So that would include things like monitoring effluent from factories, monitoring landfill leachate, wastewater treatment, effluent, things like that. But also monitoring in other ways, for example, throughout supply chains, making sure data is shared properly, making sure we have the right analytical methods to test things if we suspect there might be PFAS in product or a process, to know how to identify that. So absolutely a large part of this is going to rely on our ability to find out where PFAS are, how they get there, how they move around, because we can't control what we don't know.
Exactly. So on that, do we have the technology already to be tracking PFAS, or are there new technologies that we need to be looking at, monitoring technologies to track and trace PFAS in the environment?
Yeah, there's definitely ways to do it already, but they could be expanded or made quicker, cheaper. That's probably unsurprising because we're always looking for ways to do better monitoring and measurement, especially in situ when you're out in the field, for example. But I think at the moment we do have methods to test water for a number of different kinds of PFAS. We have some methods to test materials or products, but those could be better developed for sure. Same with soil measurement, could be better. The other thing, though, is that there are a lot of different potential kinds of PFAS. I've heard 10,000, 12, 15,000, or possibly even more different kinds, depending on what definition you use and sort of what list you're looking at. Now, that said, just because there are a lot of different kinds of PFAS that could exist, that doesn't mean every single one of those is existing out in the world at the moment that it's used commercially. But we know there are a lot that have been used commercially that either were used in the past and they're not used anymore, so we might not have good track of them anymore, or alternatively are new, and so we might not really have good track of them yet. Similarly, because PFAS are often used in quite small quantities, they don't always qualify to be registered for chemicals regulation. So, for example, under REACH, which is the UK's chemicals legislation, copied from the EU REACH, which we used to be part of in the EU, you don't need to register a substance if it's used under 1 ton per year. So because PFAS can be used in very small quantities, it's possible that we're unaware of some of the PFAS that are out there, how they're being used, because they may not meet this threshold. So due to that, sometimes we are, especially in the environment, having to resort to some suspect analysis or non-targeted analysis to try to figure out if there's other PFAS out there that we're not expecting. If so, trying to figure out what those are. And I know there's a lot of work being done on this, and researchers in the UK, for example, in particular, there's a lot of labs working on, how to better screen for PFAS that we maybe don't know are there, and try and identify what those are. Because again, it's like we can't take action on them if we don't know what's out there. And so, making sure we have that accurate picture is so important.
And with regard to the different sources of PFAS, in your opinion, are we under-monitoring or under-researching any particular sources of PFAS? Do we have some particular blind spots when it comes to PFAS?
So I think there's a couple areas that we need to understand better. First of all, we have a good idea of where PFAS are made and probably where they're used upstream in supply chain, very far upstream. But as products and chemicals and ingredients move through the supply chain, we often lose track of what exactly mixtures are made up of. So, for example, if you're a manufacturer and you're buying in an already pre-made mixture, some sort of ingredient, it might not be listed on there that there's PFAS in that. If it's not on one of these lists of substances of very high concern, which says that you have to write down that information on a safety data sheet. So if we lose that information throughout the supply chain, as you go down towards manufacturing of more finished goods or lower down in the manufacturing process, we may have lost that information at some point. So we need better information throughout the supply chain to know where PFAS might end up. So then we're looking at those sources. But the other thing is wastewater treatment plants and landfills, I would say. In particular, landfills. I think we do know that PFAS comes out of wastewater treatment plants. That's been pretty well monitored. But landfills are definitely an under-tracked area, partially because it depends on how old the landfill is. So a lot of historical landfills were built to different specifications or didn't have as many regulations, so they tend to be leakier, whereas modern landfills tend to be quite well sealed. So in the old landfill case, it tends to be that leachate might go directly into the environment, whereas newer landfills, the leachate tends to be taken to wastewater treatment plants for processing. So looking either way at those sources is important, in particular for old landfills where it goes directly into the ground. But the other thing about landfill or waste treatment facilities is that there have been some recent studies that have shown that actually more PFAS comes out of landfills than goes in. So basically that could be either that PFAS is breaking down into other kind of PFAS. So sometimes if you have a larger molecule of PFAS, it might break into some smaller monomers. But also sometimes there are transformation products or things are being brought to landfill potentially that are, again, not expecting to have PFAS, such as industrial waste, where they either aren't aware or they didn't warn the landfill. So it turns out that that's actually potentially a really large source of PFAS that we don't have as good of a handle on yet. So again, it goes back to the monitoring. We need some more monitoring of landfill leachate, and then making sure that if, in the case of modern landfills where the leachate is being pumped out and sent to a wastewater treatment facility, for example, that wastewater treatment facility is equipped to actually deal with that waste. Right now, they're not really very well set up for that.
Okay, so you mentioned there even more sources of PFAS and different sources of PFAS. What are the challenges to tracking all the different types of PFAS? Like you said, there's so many different types of PFAS. Yeah. And do we have any solutions to those sort of challenges?
That's a great question. So definitely the first challenge is that there's possibly ones out there that we don't know about. Second of all, they can transform in the environment. Not all of them. So obviously PFAS, forever chemicals, they're called that because they last in the environment for a really long time and they're famously durable and don't really break down. So when I say they break down, it sounds a bit counterintuitive. But in this case, I mean that sometimes some PFAS degrade into other kinds of PFAS. So they basically find their smallest, stablest form, and that is what persists. So, for example, there are some types of PFAS that are used in, refrigerants, for example, that end up into the environment. Those specific fluorinated gases are highly volatile and end up breaking down in the atmosphere into their smallest form of PFAS. Or sometimes if there's a tail of PFAS on the molecule, that will break off. So that is what ends up in that final form in the environment. And so when we're tracking what was released, we think, oh, well, this one was released, and we don't find that in the environment anymore. So we have to try to think about what those breakdown products might be and try to solve that puzzle of what we should be looking for, because sometimes the thing that ends up in the environment might not be what was released at first. So yeah, those issues definitely make it difficult. There's just also such a wide variety of ways it could get into the environment, because again, it could be from landfill and wastewater treatment plants. It could be from industrial facilities. A lot of PFAS contamination has come from firefighting incidents. So firefighting training, sites where there were fires, military sites and airports, which do also a lot of firefighting training for obvious reasons. Once you spray a PFAS firefighting foam out onto the ground, you can't really put it back, so it goes right in the environment. But then there's also questions about consumer products. If there's cleaning products or personal care products that we use that have PFAS in them, and then they go down the drain, that enters the system in a different way. So yeah, there's a lot of different places that they could come from, which often makes it difficult to track. And it's also often why things like wastewater treatment plants end up feeling sort of the brunt of the problem. So right now they're getting a lot of attention, because a lot of it all ends up in the wastewater treatment plant as the sort of last step in the process, whether that's from the waste stream or whether that's because they collect it from the environment due to sewage or, drinking water treatment or anything like that. So we're often seeing things end up caught in wastewater treatment. So the question is, how do we trace that back, figure out where they came from, and try to stop it farther up, stop it at the source, so it doesn't get to that point in the first place. It's trying to find that source pathway receptor. That's often what we say, the source pathway receptor model, because, ideally we'd stop it at the source. But then right now we're almost having to work backwards to try to find what those sources might be.
So speaking of stopping it at the source, could we talk a little bit about the recently introduced statutory limits on PFAS in drinking water in the UK, and also where you'd like to see things like environmental permitting go for industrial discharge of PFAS in the future?
So we don't have any statutory drinking water limits yet. We have guidelines, and that's actually one thing that we would like to see. We'd like to see them made statutory. But the guidelines are still enforceable, luckily, via the wholesomeness requirement for drinking water. So the Drinking Water Inspectorate introduced new guidance that is at a limit of 100 nanograms per liter for the sum of 48 PFAS, and that came into effect in January 2025. So that was really great to bring us a little bit more in line with some other international leading standards, like in the EU, where they have 100 nanograms per liter also as a cumulative standard. Theirs is actually for 20 PFAS and ours is for 48. So we're actually doing better there in that sense that we're looking for more, which is excellent. We would still like to see the individual limits lowered as well, because the individual limit is also 100 nanograms per liter. So because they've now got this cumulative limit, it's unlikely that any given PFAS is going to be exceeding that individual limit, but it would still be good to see that for especially some of the ones that we know that are extremely harmful, such as PFOS and PFOA. The United States, for example, has a limit of 4 nanograms per liter for each of those in their drinking water. Even the island of Jersey, actually, here in the UK, has recently said they're going to adopt a standard of 4 nanograms per liter for PFOS, PFOA, PFHXS, and PFNA, if I remember correctly. So they've taken some steps to make a lower limit for a few of those particularly bad ones as well. So we are definitely moving in the right direction there for drinking water standards. And I know the Drinking Water Inspectorate and the water companies have been doing a lot more monitoring and testing their water than, over the last few years, really ramping that up. So that is really good. In terms of other actions, though, you mentioned environmental permitting. So absolutely, that's something we think the government should be working on. The government already has the power to put environmental permits on industrial facilities or, again, landfill, wastewater treatment plants, things like that. So this is not a new power or a new tactic that can be used, but at the moment there are no limits for PFAS in environmental permits. So, for example, some sites do acknowledge that they have PFAS use either historically or currently at their site, and it is written in their permit that that is acknowledged, but there's no limit on what they can emit in their effluent. A lot of other permits don't even include it at all. So we really think that that's something that could be done to, again, stop pollution at the source. So make sure that companies have PFAS. If they're using PFAS or making PFAS, that should be in their environmental permit, and there should be limits set on how much they can emit to make sure that they're responsible for cleaning up their wastewater or, putting in appropriate control measures in the first place to prevent pollution, because obviously once it gets into the environment, it's so much harder to clean up. So yeah, environmental permitting with clear guidelines and standards will help companies to know what standards they're expected to meet. And it also can help to make sure that there can be work towards identifying best available technologies to do that cleanup or to do that control, whether that's in a factory or in a wastewater cleanup. Having those clear guidelines and limits means that there's a clear standard for everybody to work towards. I think in the past, some companies have taken measures to try to clear up their emissions or to reduce their emissions, but without any sort of standard of what they're expected, any target of what they're expected to meet, they may not be acting as quickly as we would like or as strongly as we would like. So yeah, putting that in permits would help.
Do we need to be pursuing a strengthened polluter pays principle? And what would that actually mean? What would it mean to have a stronger polluter pays principle?
Absolutely. I think this is something that's really important because we've seen, for example, with this and other issues of pollution, often we as consumers or we as citizens are footed with the bill, whether that's because environmental cleanup is something that's taken on by the government and so our taxes are funding that, or if, in the case of water treatment, our water bills have gone up. That's something we've seen in the past. We think it's really important that polluters are held to account for pollution that they create, especially something like this that's really hard to contain and can spread around in the environment once it's out there. So yeah, that's extremely important, not only to make sure that people who pollute are held accountable for what's happened in the past, but also because it's a good incentive to make sure that companies or other actors are making better choices in the future. If there is a clear polluter pays principle, then they should be incentivized to make better choices about not releasing pollution in the first place, about making better choices on managing the use of chemicals. And so it's preventative also, and also might even be a good incentive for driving innovation, for example, into new products or new processes or new materials and ingredients that can be, useful and also more safe and more sustainable. So it's sort of a dual benefit there in that it helps to clean up the past, but it also incentivizes a better future. How this has worked in other places, I should say, there are examples of the polluter pays principle that have happened in the past, but in this specific instance, one good example that's currently being implemented in the EU is the new Urban Wastewater Treatment Directive, which has been updated just this past year to help to pay for the increasing or installation of new wastewater treatment technology. So in particular, this has to deal with micropollutants, a lot of these sort of contaminants of emerging concern. And the EU has decided that sectors that are accountable for a lot of these pollutants, so for example, pharmaceuticals and cosmetics or personal care products were two of the main industries that were identified so far, are required to contribute to the cost of upgrading wastewater treatment works to deal with all of these new pollutants we're seeing. So that's a good example of how one jurisdiction is now operationalizing this polluter pays principle in wastewater treatment. Another example is the Superfund law in the US. So the US has the actual law is called CERCLA, which I can't remember the exact words that stands for, but essentially it is the law that gives the EPA, the US EPA, the power to identify who is responsible for environmental pollution and to require them to clean that up. And the Superfund is actually a levy that's assessed on all the chemicals industry that goes into this pot that helps to pay for that sort of cleanup in the case that they can't identify someone who's responsible. So for example, and this is very much applicable to the situation in the UK as well, oftentimes there are sites that are, brownfield sites that are contaminated because of historic industry, but that industry no longer exists. Maybe the company went out of business or has since been bought up by someone else or no longer exists in the UK, in the US in this case, but it could be the same in the UK. And the Superfund helps to make sure that there's money available for cleaning up when they identify those sites where there's no longer someone there to hold to account and to make pay. So those are two good examples of how the polluter pays principle has been operationalized in land contamination and in water pollution in the US and the EU.
That was Stephanie Metzger, Policy Advisor at the Royal Society of Chemistry. For more interviews like this one and articles written by other experts, please visit www.envirotech-online.com to subscribe for free today. And please follow us on whichever platform you're listening so that you never miss an episode of the Envirotech Online podcast. Thanks for listening.